Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another legal breaking reporting video analysis update. As you all are aware, Donald Trump and his administration had to attend a 3-day, that's the number 3, trial between his bogus administration stupidly federalizing the Oregon National Guard for no reason, and between the state of Oregon and the Oregon National Guard. Let's get into the reporting, ladies and gentlemen. This reporting is via an article on Substack. Ladies and gentlemen, that article is titled Day 3, Oregon v. Trump. The record closes. Ladies and gentlemen, and the article begins. The morning opened with a sharp procedural exchange over Rule 65. DOJ argued the case had, quote, morphed, unquote, into a trial on the merits, claiming that if Judge Immergut rules now, any appeal of her earlier injunction would be moot. Plaintiffs countered that's exactly why the rule exists. Ladies and gentlemen, this quote from one of the attorneys, quote, a TRO exists to preserve the status quo, unquote, one of the attorneys said. Quote, not to let the government rush a final merits ruling, unquote. Judge Immergut reminded everyone why they were there. This quote from Judge Immergut, quote, this isn't about whether individual officers used excessive force, unquote. She said, quote, it's about whether the president had any lawful basis to call out the National Guard in Oregon, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the Bailey continuation section of the article. Ladies and gentlemen, that article section begins. The first witness of the day was John Bailey, Deputy Regional Director for of the Federal Protective Services, FPS. He oversaw federal operations at Portland's ICE facility during the protests and confirmed that federal officers were always present before and after his retirement. Bailey testified that Portland Police Bureau typically wouldn't respond to federal calls for help. He also said he learned of the California and Texas National Guard deployments only informally after Oregon's Guard had already been federalized. Ladies and gentlemen, this quote from Mr. Bailey, quote, I only heard about the California and Texas Guard deployments informally, unquote. He said, quote, that was after Oregon's Guard had already been federalized, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the next section of the article, heading titled Major General Reader's Testimony. Ladies and gentlemen, that section of the article begins. Next came Major General Reader, acting Vice Chief of the National Guard Bureau. He outlined the 3 activation categories. Ladies and gentlemen, activation category 1 is SAD, otherwise known as State Active Duty, which is the governor's command. The second activation category title is Title 32, Governor Command, federally funded. The third activation category is Title 10, Federal Command, federally funded. Oregon was offered activation under Title 32, 502F, but California and Texas were activated under Title 10, placing them directly under federal control. When asked about Portland, Reader was clear. This quote from General Reader, ladies and gentlemen, quote, I was never briefed on conditions in Portland. I relied on social media reports and the court's orders, unquote. He acknowledged that he was not aware of any legal opinion authorizing the president's decision. Quote, I'm not aware of any legal opinion given to the president about whether 12406 federalization was lawful, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the next section of the article, headline titled Documents That Tell the Story. And ladies and gentlemen, that section of the article reads, the paper trail shown in court revealed the full sequence. Ladies and gentlemen, June 7th memo. Trump authorizes the Guard, quote, to protect ICE and federal personnel, unquote. Which, ladies and gentlemen, I will add that Oregon's Brigadier National Guard General said that no, that will not be their duty while being federalized. Their duty will be to protect to protect protesters, not ICE, nor their detention facilities. Ladies and gentlemen, September 26. DHS requests 200 troops for Oregon from the Secretary of War. Which, ladies and gentlemen, it's not the Secretary of War. It is realistically and lawfully the Secretary of Defense. Ladies and gentlemen, September 27th. Trump publicly announced the deployment on Truth Social. Ladies and gentlemen, DOJ counsel, quote, so when the president posted on Truth Social that was the first public confirmation of the authorization, unquote. This is reader's response, ladies and gentlemen, quote, that's correct, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, reader's memo. 2 Oregon's Adjutant General warns that if the state didn't mobilize within 12 hours, the Guard could be federalized. Ladies and gentlemen, Oregon Governor Kotek declined the offer. The next day, the White House invoked 12406, placing Oregon's Guard under federal command. Ladies and gentlemen, let's move on to the next section of the article, heading titled, A Record Without a Rebellion. And ladies and gentlemen, that section of the article reads, Reader's testimony undercut much of the government's rationale. Quote, the language about an, quote, immediate danger, unquote, wasn't tied to any specific incident, unquote. He said he couldn't identify where the troops were deployed, what their mission was, or what training they had. He noted that during the 2020 George Floyd protests, all National Guard mobilizations were state-led under Title 32, not federalized. Quote, I've never seen Title 10 used for a civil disturbance like this before, unquote. The record now shows that the Oregon deployment stemmed from a generic June memo and a Truth Social post, not a verified threat or a request from the state. That goes to the core of the case. Ladies and gentlemen, of this case. Whether a president can federalize a state's guard without its consent based solely on his own declaration. Defense rests, ladies and gentlemen. That is our next section of the article. Record closes. Ladies and gentlemen, and that section begins. After Reader stepped down, DOJ's case wound down fast. They briefly recalled Bailey to authenticate internal call logs from Portland, but he said he'd never seen them and wasn't the custodian. Judge Immergut excluded the exhibits, ladies and gentlemen, for lack of federal, foundation. With no further witnesses, the defense rested. The court then moved through exhibits, California's October 16 memos, extending both the California and Texas deployments, were omitted, as were Oregon's and Portland's after-action reports and resource charts. The only unresolved document was California's training slide deck from a separate Posse Comitatus Act, POSSE, ladies and gentlemen, in case it shows up in the reporting video transcripts as spelled incorrectly. It's spelled POSSE, which took the court, which the court took under Judge Immergut confirmed that the evidentiary record is now closed. Findings of fact are due next week, and she plans to issue a written decision before the TRO expires Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. Pacific Time. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the next section of the article, heading titled The Closings. Ladies and gentlemen, that section of the article begins, in closing, DOJ learned on technicality, quote, "We're talking about roughly 200 people, a small portion of the Oregon National Guard," unquote, government counsel argued. Quote, "The plaintiffs have not shown any actual injury," unquote. He described the Guard's deployment as a, quote, federal protection mission, unquote, and argued that the, quote, protection of federal personnel and property is a federal problem, unquote. The DOJ asked the court to deny all relief or failing that to issue a to issue a 14-day stay for appeal. Plaintiffs fired back. Quote, "Promoting public safety is not a job, not the job, or offensive language is not by itself a colorable basis to find a rebellion," unquote. they pointed to the FPS logs, to the known video showing earlier, and to testimony that federal officers were never unable to clear the ice driveway, only delayed. Quote, "If this stands," unquote, Kennedy warned, quote, "not just 200 Oregonians, but 200 Californians and 400 Texans will be federalized, despite testimony that no one knew what to do with even 200. Unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into this section of the article with a heading titled "The Judge's Final Words." Ladies and gentlemen, in that section of the article reads, Judge Immergut closed the day with a measured tone. Quote, "Thank you all," unquote, she said. Quote, "The record is closed. The court will issue its decision before Sunday night," unquote. "All exhibits are sealed, and post-trial briefs are due over the weekend. When she rules, it will be the first judicial opinion addressing a presidential use of 12406 in a domestic setting since Reconstruction." Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the next section that is titled with the heading, "What Happens Next?" And ladies and gentlemen, that section begins, "What happens next will decide more than the fate of one deployment. If Judge Immergut rules for Oregon, it will draw a hard boundary on executive power, reaffirming that the word, quote, rebellion, unquote, cannot be used as a blank check to override a state. If she rules for the government, it will mark the first modern judicial validation of a president's unilateral power to federalize a state's guard." There was no chaos in the courtroom, no no theatrics, no shouting, just the quiet weight of what this ruling will mean for the 10th Amendment, for federalism, and for the relationship between the states and the commander-in-chief. Her ruling is expected before Sunday at midnight. Ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, there is going to be at least not one but two maybe three reportings coming up after this regarding the same thing. It might be just one, it might be two, or it might be three. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, please like, comment, share, subscribe, and enjoy for more legal breaking news that you need to know about. More to come soon.